we're going to do a brief presentation to introduce the idea of properties, but then most of our time will be spent in the Formpak application, really kind of looking at them and trying to understand them. So with a few examples and explanation as we go. So a property is an attribute of a raw material or a formulation, and in the old days we might have called it a field. In a typical Formpak system, there could be 800 or more properties. And in addition to properties that we define, that Formpak defines and manages, you can add your own. Now, properties can be manually assigned or calculated, and they can do some really clever stuff, which is great, but it also means you have to get your head around the possibilities. So from an organisation point of view, properties are organised into property types and property groups. And so, for example, P102, which is a precautionary statement, is a property that appears in the property type GHS precautions, which then appears in the property group GHS hazards. Property groups, from a user perspective, are the most obvious way to organise related properties together. So, for example, you could put all physical properties in one property group so you can easily navigate to them. Some property groups and property types are critical for the correct functioning of documents. So, for example, P102 is in this particular property type here, the GHS precautions, in order that all of the precautions relevant for an individual item, either a raw material or a formulation, can be calculated and gathered together. So there's some things where there's relationships that aren't very obvious, but they are there nonetheless to make everything work. And obviously we'll go through a few of these in more detail. So as some examples of properties, you can have, for example, the property appearance, and that is a manual property. So a human being adds this information into Formpak, and it's text on a physical item, because obviously it's about a real item that does exist and what does it look like. And so an example of that text would be clear oily liquid. Then we have another manual property, so flashpoint in centigrade, and in most people's systems it's this way around, so that people would measure the flashpoint on a physical product, and they would then add that into the system, and this property is set up to be a number with units, and it's based on a physical item, because it's a physical test. An example of that information would be 74 degrees C, as we can see here. Now, if you can get from one property to another property by calculation, it's obviously convenient to do that rather than having to add lots of manual things. So as a simple example, flashpoint in Fahrenheit can be calculated based on the value of flashpoint in centigrade, because it's a mathematical calculation, and it's also number and units, and so an example would be 165 degrees Fahrenheit. In some people's systems it's reversed, so they might be measuring in Fahrenheit and calculating in centigrade. As another example of a manual property, but that does quite a lot of clever stuff, is AGN, which is allergen from a cosmetic regulation point of view, but it could just as easily be food allergen and relate to food legislation. So it's a manual property, and it's a yes or no on the regulatory composition. So this means you dig into the raw materials and see what is the thing that is the allergen, and as soon as you find that allergen you say yes. And so you mark your specified allergens with a yes, and then from there you can have some calculations. So for example, the allergen details, how many there are in a given formulation or raw material, can be calculated, and it's an entry list, which means a list of ingredients, and it's an ingredient disclosure, so disclosing the relevant ingredients based on this AGN flag. And an answer to that property calculation would be one entry, and it could be citral as an example. And some other types of properties. So you have skin sensitization category 1 is a calculated property, and it's a yes no, so either is or it isn't, and it's a custom calculation, based on SS1 equals, which relates to the hazards of the regulatory composition. We will look at this in the application because it's a bit abstract in this form. And so if the criteria were met, it would be yes. And then we have things like transport ID or the UN number, and this is also calculated, and it's text because it's a combination of letters and numbers. And this is a custom calculation using GHS hazards as the primary input, and we will have a look at that one also. And then from here, the transport proper shipping name, because that is a read across in the main to the UN number, is also text, and it's a custom calculation using that UN number as an input. And as an example, it might say environmentally hazardous substance, liquid, NOS. And there's other parts of the calculation to insert appropriate chemicals that are responsible for that hazard. Then we have the final example in the presentation is the CLP precautionary statement summary, which obviously we mentioned earlier. Again, calculated, and it's text. It's using the CLP hazards as an input. So you can see we've got lots of CLP hazards related things that then link across to other information and make other calculations work. And an example of a precautionary statement summary are this many precautions. So lots and lots of things that properties can do. Now, calculated properties can be based on physical or regulatory composition or the values of other properties. So as an example, if we imagine a mixture, a citrus mixture which contains 10% each of lemon oil, lime oil and citral. Obviously, lemon oil and lime oil are both natural and citral is synthetic. So then we would have a total natural content of 20% in that mixture. So this is an example of a calculation based on the physical composition. If we want to calculate the physical composition percentage, we need to look, the natural percentage, we need to look at the physical composition because that's where we know about the naturalness. The components of each of these don't tell us about the naturalness, only the physical components do. Then with the same mixture, we might be wanting to determine hazards, so GHS or related hazards. And for that, we actually need to look inside these physical items and look at the regulatory composition. So have we got certain hazards on certain substances that mean that something gets classified? So as an example, we would be looking at the level of citral overall. So if we've got 10% of lemon, which contains 1.8% citral, and lime oil with 7% citral, and obviously this is 100% citral. So the total citral in the mixture would be 10.88, and that then would be relevant for hazard classification and other things as well. But we've looked inside. And then we have the third type of calculation, which is a calculation based on the value of other properties. If we've determined, for example, the GHS hazards of a mixture, we can use those results to determine the value of other properties. So if we've determined this formulation is classified as a skin sensitizer because of the citral level, that skin sensitizer endpoint as a regulatory calculation can be used to say, well, okay, if that criteria is met, that means we need the signal word warning, the pictogram exclamation mark, and also the hazard may cause an allergic skin reaction. So from one property calculation, you can determine the value of other properties. So what we're going to do next is go into Formpak, look at some of these properties and their uses, and also look at navigating properties on items, reviewing properties, searching for properties, and finding and reporting properties for items. There's our contact details. Okay, so here's our Formpak system, which I think is probably familiar to most of you. And I'm going to first of all, have a look at one of those raw materials we were just discussing, which is the lemon oil. And you can see the usual format where we have all of the different tabs. And in the Properties tab, we can see the property groups. So this is how, from a user perspective, you organize them into property groups to help you navigate. That's its main purpose. And there's property groups that come with the system for any new system. You can add additional property groups, and you can also change the order. So this presentation is a standard one, but you can change it if you prefer a different order. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look in the natural sources property group. We can see we have this NAT1. So NAT1 in this system is being used to indicate if something is natural. So you can see here it's not got a tick, so it's been manually assigned to this raw material to say it's natural. And from that choice there, is NAT1 is ticked as yes. So basically, because this is manually assigned, here it's saying it's natural. And it's this kind of relationship that then can be used in formulations to calculate the total percentage of natural and that kind of thing. So I'm going to have a look at another, sorry, let me show you the existing properties as well. So when you open a property group, it will show you the properties which have something useful to say, but you can also click on show all properties to then see everything that is in that property group. You can see, for example, we have organic, we have another type of natural, we have, for example, natural lemon. So there's lots of different ways you can calculate naturalness, and certainly for flavours that's really quite important because you maybe have different perspectives that you need to capture. You can have as many properties as you need to capture those different perspectives. To switch back to the existing, and then we'll have a look at another property group, which is cosmetics. And for press C, everything that begins with C is then displayed. So you can flip between the natural order that is presented in and the alphabetical. We're going to look at the cosmetics and detergents. And we can see on here, we've got lots and lots of calculated properties. Everything has got a tick. And at the top, we've got AGNing details, where it's been calculated from the components of this raw material, which allergens and how much. And this is based on citral. This component will have AGN equals yes, and that's why it's appearing in this list. So it's a regulatory composition calculation, looking inside for the things with AGN and listing them. If we look at a formulation, it's quite similar. There sometimes can be differences between the way a raw material and a formulation behave for property calculations, because sometimes that's what you need. But they're very, very similar in most cases. So if we look at a formulation that represents the short formulation we were looking at before, the citrus mixture, we can see on the composition here, so we obviously have the lemon at 10, lime at 10, citral at 10, and then just some diluent, just so that we can not be worried about other components and just focus on these ones. In the Properties tab, we've got the same property groups, so represented obviously in the same order. And then if we look at the transport hazards, you can see that at the moment, this is classified in transport class 9, and obviously you can look at all of these are calculated. So this has been calculated based on the hazards of the formulation, and then a read across to what that means for transport. If we go back to the physical data though, we can see that there's no flash point yet. And so that's also an input to that, to hazard, and then hazard might change and we might end up with something different. So I'm going to just show that. So if we modify this formulation and add in a flash point, if we deliberately make it flammable, so what I'm going to do, so I've manually added that. If I calculate it, and I'm forcing it to calculate in order that I can show you what happens, but there are ways of automating property calculations so that everything's always up to date, and I'll show you that towards the end. So you can see our Fahrenheit has been calculated based on our centigrade flashpoint. But we've also had another effect, because this is now flammable from a transport point of view. It will have affected the GHS as well. It's now changed to transport class 3 because that has got a higher priority than being a marine pollutant. So you can see how a manually added property can impact more than one hazard, and that is more than one property, and that's very typical. So let's go back to that physical data. What I'm also going to do is show you the cosmetics group. So again, we can look at those allergen details, and this is getting sort of rolled up from the regulatory components of the raw materials to then say, across all of the ingredients that are used, which are the common ingredients, so that the single ingredients that, you know, could be in more than one but might only appear once, and what is their level. And so this is now the same 3 allergens, but obviously different levels because we're looking at a formulation. Now, what I'm going to save this formulation like this, and then we're going to view it and take a look at some of the views of the formulation, because there's lots of things that you can do and ways you can sort of interrogate information to see what's going on and where. But there's a very useful report called Print Composition. Print Composition will show you what you request. So if we look at the physical explosion without making any changes, this shows you what the raw ingredients would be that really exist. So these are really existing things. If you have a calculation and it's based on physical composition, then these are the ingredients that will be looked at to determine the answer. On the other hand, if you have a regulatory calculation, then this view of the composition is what will be considered in determining the answer. So here you can see we have the allergens, for example, the citral, the limonene, and the geraniol. They were the focus in that regulatory check for, or that regulatory property calculation for the allergens that existed. Now, obviously, they're the 2 views that Formpak uses when it's making a calculation. There is another view that's actually pretty helpful if you're trying to find out, well, where are these things, particularly in a regulatory composition. It can be quite tricky to see them. But if you choose structure, you can then see that, for example, it keeps the lemon oil, the physical, and then tells you what the regulatory components are and the level that they are at, and then just goes in turns. So this means we'll have citral appearing more than once, we'll have limonene appearing more than once, because it's common to some of those, it's common to both lemon and lime. So this shows you where things are. So sometimes this is a useful first pass if you're trying to find out where something is. Not always, but sometimes. So what we're going to do now is, if we again quickly just look at this cosmetics and detergents property. Here, they're the values, and we're going to have a look at that specific property. So I'm going to view this property. And this is how properties are presented in Formpak. And as long as you've got permission within your organisation, obviously you can see them and you can see how they're working. So this is the code and the name, the property type and property group, and then the type of value we're expecting for this property. If we click on the calculation tab, we can see that yes, it's calculated. It is a standard rule, and this is the method that's being used. It's an ingredient disclosure method, and it's looking for the property AGN in the regulatory composition. So hopefully you can see that So it would explode a raw material or formulation, look for any of them that contain AGN as a property, and then pull them together in the ingredient disclosure method to then make an entry list. And although this is a standard method, there is a rule that is underneath that, and this is obviously the method, but because this is used for lots of different things, it is a standard method because it's possible to be one. So you could imagine a similar type of property for food allergens or biologically active principles, so things like pulegone and I think it's methyl eugenol. So if we switch to that one, it's basically the same scenario, but looking at a different component flag, again, but regulatory composition, and this one also has a lower limit. So in this case, it's saying don't worry about them if they're lower than this percentage. And again, so dependent on the specific requirement and also sometimes on business needs, you might have cut-offs that you introduce to these calculations. So we might have something that's quite complicated and a complicated formulation. So looking at the composition from a print point of view might be a long way to try and find the answer. So there's also another method, which is analysis reports. This you can navigate to analysis reports from the main menu, but also from other menus of items. So other menus and item analysis. And so it's obviously got the item. And what I'm going to do, because obviously I know that I'm interested in the regulatory component, so I'm looking at a regulatory report. So I'm looking at item regulatory components, and I'm interested in the ones that I'm interested in and where they're from. So that's with the property and then the sources. And so the property I'm interested in is the AGN. If I print, it will now show me, okay, so the geraniol is in the lemon oil, the citral is in 3 things, and the limonene is in 2 things. So in a complex situation, being able to have this view, and you can do it for any property, is very helpful to sort of expose where you have the values coming from. It's because it also helps you understand why did you get to the answer of 3, because when you look at it in this way, you can absolutely see how that became required. So this time we're going to have a look at the skin sensitizer property. And so here, in this case, it's appearing in more than one property type and more than one property group, and that's completely fine. So if you have a property that is useful to see in more than one place, you can just add it to another property group for visualization. In this case, the SS1 is a yes/no. If we look at the calculation, it's custom. And what this is doing is, and it's not necessary to understand all of the code, but you can kind of see because of this here, it's looking at SS1 equals SS1A and SS1B to then determine is the answer yes or no to is the whole thing a skin sensitizer or not. And if we look at the SS1 equals, this is a percent and TFE. So this is about how much of a raw material or how much of a formulation is contributing to the skin sensitization potential of that product. And this is really important for suitability checking because the percent and TFE allows you to express that if you dilute a product, so you dilute a fragrance in a EDT, then what does that do to this percentage? And so that's why these kind of properties exist. And here it's looking again at the values of the SS1, SS1A, SS1B, and it's also taking into account the trigger levels for those properties, because dependent on whether it's a 1 or a 1A or a 1B, the dilution or the way it gets diluted is affected. So it's having to take into account all those parameters. And you don't need to understand all of this, of course, but understanding some of the relationships and kind of a little bit of background can be helpful. So if we going back to the formulation, so if we look at the GHS hazards, so we can see, so you've got loads and loads of calculated values. And then as we saw in the presentation, some of these values are, so things like flammable liquid, that the classification of that, which was based on the flashpoint value, will then allow the flame pictogram to be calculated. And if we look at the environmental one as well, we've got acute 2 and chronic 2 for environment, which also then leads to the environment hazard. And as we go down, you can see as well that we have the H411. And so you can see here the individual answers are yes, but then some of the other properties, if we go down, you see each one of the properties here, so the precautions are yes, but we then have these properties that can gather things together. So the whole of the phrases for precautions are here as the precautionary statement summary, which is basically the sum of the ones at the bottom. And things like this then can get used in documents. Now, if we wanted to search for properties, so from a navigation of raw materials and formulations, property groups are where to look. So if you wanted to look at a particular item, property groups are great. If you wanted to find out what styles of property you have on your system, because maybe you want to add a new one and you want to see, okay, what have I got that's similar, then search for property is really useful. So I'm going to click on search for property. And you can see this is obviously a search screen. If we search for everything, it would expose all of them. And there's multiple pages. So we've got over 800 in this system. And if we wanted to maybe look at, okay, we're interested in adding a property that's based on a physical composition. We're hoping it's going to be a standard calculation because we don't want to get into that custom stuff. And so we might search for this to say, okay, well, what kind of things have we got that are looking at the physical composition that are a standard calculation? If we search, so you can see now that these things are different methods, but they're all looking at that physical composition to determine the answer. And so when you then scroll down here, you might think, okay, this property is similar to the idea that I have for a new property. So it's a good way of looking at properties that might be good as a starting point. There's other ways as well to look at properties, and a lot of the time see, from a regulatory setup point of view, you're interested in all of these things, but from a day-to-day point of view, you might be interested in reporting information about properties. So find matching items is a really useful way of being able to do that. So if we go FMI using the initials, find matching items, and we can search for example, raw materials that are the regulatory raw materials, and if we press search, we'll find all of them. And from here you can print, and what you can choose what to print. So we're not interested in those kind of things for that, but on the properties, maybe you're interested in the GHS hazard summary or the hazard and category statement, and maybe you're interested in the CLP one as a comparison, for example. So if you choose those two properties, you can then print. And obviously we didn't do much of a search. We just said, okay, just show us everything about the regulatory items. And so you can then see the difference between the GHS and the CLP. But you can do that for any properties. So that's quite useful. There's another one that's also useful, which is a property item property report. So if we do print item property report, if you have a lot of properties that you're trying to view at the same time, this is handy because you can do select by property group. So you don't have to type in the ones that you want to have in your report. You can select them by property group. So as an example, and I'm going to use the basket as well. So you can use the basket in find matching items as well, but I'm just going to use it here. So, okay, I'm going to look at the items I've got in basket 3. So this is just 2 formulations, and maybe I'm interested in all of the food information that's available for these items. That's okay. And so it's looked in that property group and pushed all of those properties in to say we want to look at all of them. You can remove them individually, but going back to the point that was made earlier, if you wanted to add your own property group, you can. And so if you're routinely looking at, say, transport, flashpoint, GHS hazards, and something to do with food and something to do with fragrances, you could put those properties into a single property group to enable you to report on them really, really easily. So, and there's options to print in different formats, so Excel, for example, which is helpful for further analysis, but I'll just use the default, which is PDF. You can see that they pop out here, and it's 12 pages long because it's a very long property group. And obviously it's reporting everything. It's not just reporting the values of interest, it's showing you every single one and what the value is. That's a useful way to look at properties of items. Now, what I'm going to do next is add a new property. To show you how this works. And it's very useful to have a similar property open on another screen in order that you can kind of guide yourself through these kind of things, because it's for people who know what they're doing. It can still be a challenge sometimes because some of the property calculations are quite complex. So having an example at the side of you is always a good thing. I'm going to add a simple one, which is log P. So this is a property that doesn't exist yet, and I've got on my other screen, I've got what I'm going to call this as a name. So it's the octanol water partition coefficient, and as it's a physical property, that's where I'm going to add it. So I'm going to say physical data and physical data again, and then it's a number because it's a measurement. And when you click number, you can see that you get some options. If I'd clicked yes, no, I would have different options, but I'm clicking number. And it says 3 decimal places. It's suggesting to me, I think only 2 is necessary, so I'm going to change it. It's showing me, do I want to have it as a equals? Or I've got these other options, and I do want it to be an equals because it's a number that it definitely equals. And then unit of measure. If there was a unit of measure, I could either select it from the list, or I could add in any unit of measure that I want to. So the units of measure that are presented are just examples, but you can have others because there's lots of them. And this one doesn't have a unit of measure. It's not going to be calculated, so I don't need to worry about the calculation. I'm just going to save. Because there's no property calculation, I'm going to bypass the calculation. Now, this property immediately exists, so I can straight away add it to a raw material. So I'm going to go into modify a raw material, pick geraniol, and I'm going to add it to the regulatory composition. I could add it to both, but I'm going to add it to the regulatory composition because for me it's more relevant there because it's about measurements on single chemicals rather than things like essential oils. So for me it makes sense to add it here. And if I do that, property, there it is. We come over to here and we have that it equals, and in the value of 3.28. So now that exists. If you have data that exists outside of Formpak and you want it to be added in, we can help with that. So it would be, if you wanted to, upload all of the log P values for 200, 1,000, 2,000 chemicals, it's not great to have to do them manually. So we can help with importing values of properties that are useful to you. It is chargeable because it's custom. And then just on the more general topics of properties and managing them, obviously today we've looked at properties, made some changes to items, pushed the calculation by doing calculate now in order to get the answer straight back. But in a system, what there should be is some automatic processing happening, so that ideally during time when the system's not being used, you can schedule property calculations so that they regularly occur. And then when because some of the things we've done today are quite simple, like making a flashpoint or changing a flashpoint, there's a very clear relationship between what that's going to do for items, but there's other things that are less clear. So if a classification of a regulatory component changes, you need to know what the impact of that is across all of the raw materials and formulations that are in your system. And it's property calculation that allows that calculation to happen. So typically people undertake this every day after the system stopped being used. You can do it while the system is used, but because it's quite intensive, if you can do it while the system's not being used, it's better. And then there's other checks that you can put in as well. So this is just one task in this system, but you can have other calculations happening as well. When you make a change to a property, if you change the flashpoint or if you make a manual change, even if it's adding an appearance, the values of the properties are captured in the system. So I'm just going to go back to that formulation and show you. So on the properties tab here, you can see properties version is version 4, dated today, and that's because we added that flashpoint. So what I can do is look at outdated versions of properties. Again, looking at that item. Oh, it's obviously not. Don't know, for whatever reason, I can't remember the code of this item. So it's showing you as a standard position, it will always show you the current property version, and it does it by property group because obviously there's so many of them, and you can look at previous versions. Obviously this is where the flashpoint wasn't there, and other versions, and obviously the original version as well. And so anytime you've made a manual change to a property of an item, it versions it, you can see here, and then you can look back at the versions across time for your formulation. Because the property calculations are happening on a continuous basis with automatic processing running regularly, it's not capturing every single tiny change because it would just be a huge amount of data. So for example, if a classification of a raw material changes and that changes the classification of a mixture, that's not a manual change, it's a calculated change, and that wouldn't cause a version change on here because that can happen almost continually. You could have a change every single day. So if you want to capture information on a set schedule so that you know the answer to everything in your system on a particular day, there are snapshots. So snapshots allow you to say capture all the values now. So it doesn't do anything to the versioning. It just enables you to capture a snapshot, you give it a name, and then you can view snapshots and compare them. So if you wanted to, say if you were about to do the labeling manual update or some big regulatory set of changes, you could capture the snapshots before you started and then after everything was recalculated and you'd finished. And then you could compare them to see what were the overall changes. You can additionally, in automatic processing, set when you want to record those snapshots. So you could set that once a month. So you'd probably have a different task name, maybe record snapshot monthly, and you could click that and then set that every month it records a snapshot of items so that you have that as an ongoing monitoring of your status.